Materials and methods used in making ancient books. This is a fascinating area, an enriching area for us, but it also helps us to get a little bit of a glimpse about what we have in these manuscripts and what material they actually would have had if we only have a fragmentary manuscript, for example. We'll look at this and see what we can learn about textual criticism when we learn how ancient books were actually produced. Well, there were two kinds of books in the ancient world: the roll, or sometimes called the scroll, and the codex. The roll, we all know, if you've got toilet paper at home, I presume it's on a roll. And if you have anything that is bound on the left side with cut pages that flip, that's a codex. Both of these have very, very ancient roots. The codex was not something that was produced in the Middle Ages. It was produced actually in the 1st century AD, late in the 1st century as far as we can tell. But what's interesting is that over the next 500 years, the Codex was used by Christian writings 80% of the time. In other words, 80% of all Christian literature for 500 years was written on a Codex. Only 20% of all non-Christian literature was written on a Codex in those first 500 years. This was the first, and to date the only time in history that the church has been ahead of the technological curve. And yet they were at the very beginning. There's been fascinating discussions about why did they use the Codex and how soon did they begin to use the Codex. Was it there from the beginning? Some scholars originally thought, yes, this was a form. Some said the Codex form was invented by Christians so they could get to their proof texts faster, because to get through a roll, it takes a lot longer, because if your life is on the line, no, here's the proof, so they can argue and debate. Some have suggested they did it as a reaction to the Jewish scrolls for their scriptures. The problem with that view is that every other book in the world was on a scroll, not just the Jewish scriptures, everything. So why go with the Codex? We still don't have the answer to that yet. But one thing we can say is that the New Testament books originally had to have been written on scrolls, almost surely. And let me just point out a few things about 3 New Testament books and how this fact, or this almost certain fact, helps us to interpret what's going on. The book of Hebrews, the letter to the Hebrews. The author doesn't mention his name, doesn't mention his associates, and he doesn't mention who he's writing to. Why is that? Is that unusual? Well, it probably would be unusual if this were a codex. But on a scroll or a roll, letters were of 2 types. Either they would put the addressee on the inside of the papyrus roll, and when you roll that papyrus up, that's where it's going to be the most protected. Or they'd put the addressee and the author on the outside, and often by an affixed label on the outside. And then you have this courier who's carrying this across the Mediterranean world to some other place, and it's going to get rubbed against, sometimes it's in a pouch, it's going to rub against other manuscripts or leather that's holding it in place, sometimes even the courier's hands. I have looked at a number of ancient papyri. I can't tell you how many hundreds of texts I've looked at. But what I found is this, that these papyrus letters where the author and the addressee are written on the outside or the verso of the papyrus. Verso, if you think of reverse, it comes from the word, the Latin word verso. That is always fainter than the text on the inside. So, what would that suggest? Whoever this courier is, taking this letter from the author to the Hebrews to some place, I think probably in Asia Minor, but that's just an educated guess. He's carrying this letter, and the outside of the addressee and the author, where that's on the outside of the letter, it gets rubbed off. By the time it gets there, it's no longer there. He knew who he was taking it to. They knew who they were, and they knew who the author was. But would they put that in the text if it was no longer in the text? No. Meanwhile, how does Paul write his letters? He always puts his name in there on the inside, and he always puts the addressee on the inside. And that's why we haven't lost that material. But the letters were done in 2 different ways in the ancient world. Hebrews does it one way, Paul does it another way. This is one of the reasons why I would argue very strongly there's no way Paul could have written this. That's not a reason to say Paul could not have written it, but it's one of the evidences that suggests that he did not. So that helps us to understand that a little bit. Revelation chapter 5, verse 1. John says, "Then I saw in the right hand of the one who was seated on the throne a scroll written on the front and back and sealed with 7 seals." Well, the scroll, what he calls a book, but typically that more referred to a scroll rather than a codex, it was written on the front and back. That's unusual for a scroll. They were typically written just on the inside, and that's because of them having been written on papyrus. Papyrus is a reed that grows in the Nile River and just a couple of other places in the world, and they would take these long strips of the papyrus stems and lay them out perpendicularly to each other and beat them until they adhered naturally from just the juices from the papyrus. And then you'd have this cross pattern where you have these fibers of the papyrus going this way and fibers going this way, and then they'd cut them into long rolls and sew them together so they'd have a scroll or a roll. Normally, it was written just along the fibers that go horizontally. In other words, you write on the inside, that's the papyrus that you put on the inside is just the horizontal fibers, and then you have the vertical fibers are going to be on the outside to keep it, have good binding for it. But people didn't write on that vertical because it's too hard to write against the grain like that. If a manuscript was written on both sides, a roll was meant on both sides, it was called an epistograph. Episto meaning written on the back side as well. And so John says here is an epistograph that he saw, written on the front and back, which was unusual. And then he says it was sealed with 7 seals. Now, if this were a codex and it were sealed with 7 seals, then you could get to any one of these seals by just breaking that seal open. But if it were written on a scroll, you couldn't. If it's written on a scroll, you're unraveling this, you get to the first seal. You have to slice that, then you can get into the second seal, and then slice that, then get to the third, and so on. So you have to take these seals in sequence. But if you have this sealed on the outside of a codex, say, you know, I don't want to read through the first 6 chapters. I want to get to the end of the book and see who done it. You can do that on a codex. You couldn't do it on a scroll if it had these seals. And so that's why John is writing this and talking about these seals in sequence. Revelation chapter 6:1 through 8:1, we see that the Lamb opens the 7-seal book, one book at a time and in sequence. And of course, that would not be necessary if the book were a codex. And then there's Mark's Gospel. We'll give a full lecture on the ending of Mark's Gospel, but here's one thing I just wanted to note. The debate in terms of the text of Mark's Gospel has to do with the ending of it. Did he write through Mark chapter 16, verse 8, where the angel tells the women, go and tell the disciples that Jesus has risen from the dead and meet him in Galilee? And then it goes on, it says, and they did nothing for they were afraid. Period. End of story. Which is a bizarre way to end a book, it would seem. Or did Mark write more than that? Verses 9 through 20, which has the passage about picking up snakes and not getting hurt and drinking poison, which also seems pretty bizarre. Or is the real ending of Mark's Gospel lost? Now that's the view that through the first half of the 20th century, most biblical scholars said, oh yeah, the end of Mark's Gospel was lost. Well, let's think about that for a moment. Mark's Gospel would have been written on a scroll. The Codex form was not even invented yet. And later, his copies would be on a codex. So if Mark writes on a scroll, what's the most protected part of that manuscript? You write on the text, you're writing it out, you write all the way through 16 chapters, you get done, and then you roll that scroll back up. The most protected part of the manuscript is the end of it. Mark 16, you're not going to lose those verses. Stephen Fawn, who's a professor in Jerusalem and works on the Dead Sea Scrolls, I asked him one time about some of these scrolls that he had seen. He'd seen hundreds of them, and I said, have you ever come across a scroll that they did not rewind? where it was, the end was the part that was most exposed. He said, yes, in all the hundreds that I've looked at, I've seen one. Only one. So that guy probably had to pay a denarius at his local video store, for a scroll store, whatever you want to call it. What is that place called now? I forgot. Blockbuster Video, that's what it's called. I forgot because we don't use those anymore. But, if you didn't rewind your video, you have to pay $1 or something, so that's how it was in the ancient world too, I'm sure. Finally you got it, sorry. But Mark's Gospel, the most protected part of this would surely have been the end of it. The beginning, not nearly so, but the end would have been protected. To argue that the copy that Luke had and the copy that Matthew had when they came across Mark's Gospel, not only did they miss it at exactly the same point, it quit at 16:8, but that both of them must have been using a Codex copy of Mark's Gospel is to presuppose two linked hypotheses that are exceedingly weak and almost surely impossible. And so you'd have to assume Mark's Gospel would have been very early on converted into a Codex form, and that last leaf of the Codex fell out at exactly the same point. It just doesn't want to work. So here's some of the things that help us just in terms of the shape of these books. But now let's think about the copies of the New Testament. Are they on scrolls? This is what's absolutely fascinating. All but 4 papyri that we have of the New Testament were written on codices. We have 127 of them so far and counting. 127 New Testament papyri, all but 4 are written on codices. And I think we have 2 or 3 other manuscripts that were written on a roll, but it's a vertical roll, not a horizontal roll. It was done for liturgical purposes, something different, but much, much later. The 4 that were written on scrolls, all of them were on reused scrolls that had been used for some other purpose. And the New Testament text is on the verso, and some other text is on the recto. The recto is the right side or the inside, the horizontal fiber side. The verso is the back side or the outside or the vertical fiber side. And so these manuscripts that are written on scrolls were written on the back of a scroll that was used. Maybe somebody wrote out Homer's Iliad or something, or parts of it on a scroll, and then the backside would have been empty. And so somebody comes along and says, hey, this guy discarded the scroll. I don't have enough money to buy a papyrus, but I can buy a pen. I'm going to write out Paul's letter to the Ephesians or something like that. That's how we find these things. Only 4 of them on scrolls, and on scrolls that initially had some other purpose. We don't have a single New Testament manuscript that was originally written on a scroll intended for a New Testament manuscript to be on a scroll. And there's no other extant New Testament manuscripts that are written on scrolls. This is pretty astounding. We have some that go back very, very early too, 2nd century. So what's to explain this? There's some interesting things that we can't yet explain about the text of the New Testament. First of all, why is it that all of them, except for these 4 exceptions, were written on a codex? When the codex was invented just at about the time the New Testament was being completed, and yet it just didn't even take off in the non-Christian world for 5 centuries. Secondly, why is it that all of our New Testament manuscripts have what's known as nomina sacra, or sacred names, that are abbreviated? There's 15 words that were used as kind of sacred names, and certainly the term for the Lord in Hebrew manuscripts, Yahweh, which uses just those Hebrew letters, but it uses the vowel points for another word, Adonai, and it's how the Jews would, every time they came to see Yahweh, they would not pronounce Yahweh, instead they'd pronounce Adonai. And European scholars who didn't understand what those vowel points meant thought it went with those words, and so they came up with the word Jehovah, which is a completely made-up word. Jehovah does not occur. But it was certainly that Yahweh, as a word that was read one way, seen one way, but pronounced another way, inspired the Christians to use these nomina sacra. The 4 earliest ones, this is really fascinating, the 4 earliest nomina sacra were Jesus, Christ, Lord, and God. Later they used Jerusalem, Mary, David, the cross, a number of different words, but Jesus, Christ, Lord, and God were the 4 original nomina sacra. And There's not a single New Testament manuscript that has these words in it that doesn't have them as abbreviated forms. Going way back into the 2nd century. We have no shred of evidence as to why the Christians did this or how soon they did it. But it had to be from the very beginning. More and more scholars are getting more and more comfortable with the idea that this must have happened pre-AD 70. Well, then you have this third feature. These are some mysteries about the New Testament manuscripts that we still don't have answers to. But one of the mysteries is that when it comes to the writing of ancient Greek literature, we have virtually no examples. And when I say virtually no examples, it's like 0.001% of all the ancient Greek literature we have in manuscript copies where numbers are abbreviated. They would always write out the word for the number. So if you said 1,000 in Greek, you would spell that out, 1,000, instead of put 1000, as we would in English. They didn't actually use Arabic numbers in. What they had in Greek were letters that represented a number. So you'd have, for example, Petros Epistolae Alpha, which means, or Petru Epistolae Alpha, that means that the letter of Peter, the first. Alpha would be the first. And then Petru Epistolae Beta, the letter of Peter, the second. And they'd put a horizontal bar over that letter to say, don't read this as the letter alpha, read it as the number 1. So that horizontal bar means read this differently than how it appears. Same way as the vowel points with Yahweh for the Old Testament. Why is it that New Testament manuscripts don't follow that literary pattern? And they don't. We have a number of manuscripts early on through the 4th, even some into the 5th century that use the number abbreviations instead of the literary writing of the word completely out. This one's a little bit easier to answer. The reason, it seems, is that the earliest scribes for the New Testament were not professionally trained. They were scribes who learned how to write out text because they were bureaucrats and bean counters and CPAs. That means they're dealing with numbers all the time. And so when they're dealing with numbers, how do you write out numbers? When you do mathematics, if you say even 2 plus 2 equals 4, do you write out TOO, PLUS, TO, that's not right, TWO plus TWO, then spell the word equals FOUR. Of course not. You just put the numbers 2 plus 2 equals 4, the abbreviations as we do, the symbols. It seems that our earliest scribes for the New Testament were not professionally trained, but they were trained adequately to write out these texts. And if they're trained to be bureaucrats and bean counters, they're not the creative kinds of people who are going to come up with messing around with the text. They're going to be faithful copyists. The text may not be pretty, but they will be faithful copies. And this is where Bart Ehrman would say our earliest scribes were not professionally trained. Well, that's true in terms of being a literary scribe, but they were professionally trained in terms of being a bureaucrat or somebody who worked well with numbers. And it's absolutely fascinating to look at these manuscripts. So we've got all of our New Testament manuscripts have nomina sacra, they're all written on a codex, and then many of the early ones have these numbers written as abbreviations instead of full out. Those three things seem to have converged very, very early on. And I'm wondering whether a place like Jerusalem or even Antioch, the church before the end of the 1st century said, this is how we will distinguish our books. Something to let other Christians know fairly quickly, this is a Christian document. I don't know yet. Nobody does, but it's really fascinating to think about those things. Well, the making of a codex. How would these books be made? This involved the use of what's called quires. A quire is one or more double leaves, also known as a bifolio, folded in the middle and sewn into the binding. And the earliest codices were single quire books. That is, well, let me illustrate this with P46, written in about the year 200. It's a single quire codex. It had originally at least 10 of Paul's letters in it. And it had 104 leaves. So let me see if I can illustrate this with some paper and show you how we look at this. I've got 4 sheets of paper here, and I'm going to number them. In the upper right-hand corner, 1. I know this seems simple, but it gets a little complex and just makes it easy for you to see it by way of this illustration. 1, 2, 3, and then 4. So I've got 4 sheets of paper numbered in the upper right-hand corner on the front. Now, this would be how many sheets they would use to make the average size choir by about the 4th century. 4 sheets. A sheet is like this, and it would be folded. When it's folded, each section, each half is called a leaf. The total thing is called a bifolio or double leaf or single sheet. And each side of each leaf is called a page. So these are technical terms. Sheet, page, and leaf are all different. Now, here's what would happen. When it came to papyri, they'd have the manuscript that is got the horizontal lines like this. And I'm just going to show you how this would be done. Now, just to make sure I'm completely redundant, got the vertical on the back side. Isn't this exciting? So I've got these 4 sheets of papyrus, and you can see this would be the standard way in which it was done after a certain point. I'm going to take these 4 sheets. Every one of these sheets has got the recto on the front side like this. So you can see 1, 2, 3, and 4. They're all horizontal or recto. I take these 4 sheets, I fold them in half. Now I've got a choir. 4 sheets, 8 leaves, 16 pages. This is a choir. The way they would make books after a certain point, typically in the 4th century or a little bit later, is they'd have a multi-choir book that would all have these 8-leaf choirs or 4-sheet choirs that would be sewn into the binding. This is how books today are made. Same way. If you got a hardbound book, it's sewn into the binding. They got these 8-leaf choirs and sewn in. You take P46. Instead of 8 leaves, it's got 104 leaves. Now, if you take 104 leaves, or basically we're talking about 52 pieces of paper, and you fold that in half, what's going to happen? You're going to bulge in the middle. Well, that's going to look ugly. So you're going to trim that outside off. So now you open it up. What are the pages that have less material on them? It'll be the inside pages that have shorter lines. The outside pages will have longer lines. And we're going to come to that very issue when we talk specifically about P46, because it's missing some books. It's missing the pastoral epistles, 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus. Why is it missing those? Well, it relates, I think, to the size of this. But here's what I wanted to point out about this. So we've got this text, and it starts out as you're going through this, and you've got recto. So you're gonna have, this is an 8-leaf choir. Notice what's recto. Recto to begin with, then verso here, recto, verso, etc. Now, as I was thinking about this, I suggested that if we had recto on one side of a sheet of a leaf and on the back side it was verso, then that means it's the first half of the choir. And you can see how that's the case. Recto is the front, verso the back, recto, front, 3, and then 4 then you get to the back of this, and now you've got, actually here's the back of 4. Now you get verso and verso. And so now the front of this, at the end of this, becomes the back, and then the back side of the page 4, or leaf 4 becomes recto. I know it's confusing. I'm even getting confused on the terminology, but you can experiment with this at home, and you can see it, and it's safe to do at home too. So basically, I thought, here's this papyrus that had Acts chapter 2 on it on the verso. If they were producing them this way, that told me, and on the recto was Acts 3. So I thought, oh, that means it was in the second half of the choir. And if that's how they did the production, that told me, it's just a little fragment about the size of a bandage. That told me that this was a manuscript that had more than Acts in it, because this is the second half of the choir. Surely it had more than just Acts 1 in the first half. And so one of my students, a fellow named Rex Howe, did his master's thesis on this fragment to see if it had more than Acts. And so here, from this one bandage-sized strip of papyrus, he was trying to determine if this manuscript actually had maybe one of the Gospels in it. And so he worked through all this, and lo and behold, since it was a 3rd century fragment, he discovered that they didn't necessarily follow this method. So we can't be sure if it had the Gospels in it, but it's definitely possible that it did. So that's how we had to leave things. But that's one of the things that we do with these manuscripts, is we try to look at this to think through exactly what's going on with what material would have been in there. Okay, so we'll talk about P46 later. Let's move on here. As the art of making books improved, the standard choir size became 8 leaves or 4 bifolios. Most books from about the 4th century on used 4 bifolios per choir. And when examining a codex, one can usually get a quick and dirty sense of how much material is there. That's what we've done with the Center for the Study of New Testament Manuscripts. When you examine the material, the manuscript in the flesh, you can tell this. But you can't always tell it looking at photographs. In fact, rarely. How many choirs does a manuscript have? Well, how do you tell? You have to see where the threading is. And the only way you can tell that is by looking inside the binding, if it's not too tight. And you can also tell by the pressure of the leaves. The first leaf, if you're on the very first leaf, it's going to lay as flat as it can. Every leaf after that gets pulled up by the front leaf of the choir. And so just a little bit of pressure that you're not going to catch on film at all is what's going to tell you where you are in the choir. And so we have been counting the choirs, how many leaves per choir we have just before we photograph these manuscripts. It's the fastest way I know to tell whether a manuscript actually has its complete text or not. If all of the choirs are 8-leaf choirs, we got the whole thing. Sometimes we'll find a 6-leaf choir or less than 8 leaves, and we say, oh, okay, it's not complete here. And so it's one of those things that helps us to think about this. Otherwise, it might take 100 hours to find out how much material is actually missing.